From the KPFK studios in Southern California,
it's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host David Feldman. Hello, David. How are you?
Good morning, everybody.
And we have the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hey, it's going to be a great show. We're going to have a lot of questions from you.
Yes. On the show today, we welcome Matt Stoller from the Open Markets Institute. You'll hear a lot from business people who will extol the virtues of the free market. Of course, we all know that the free market is a fiction, like Santa Claus. I guess I should have said spoiler. Yeah, I should have said spoiler alert like that.
Thanks.
Sorry, David. I don't know if it's the free market or Santa Claus that I just spoiled for you, but I know somewhere Stephen Moore is crying. My point is...
And so is his wife.
Yeah. My point is that, like the Santa Claus fantasy, these free marketeers are devoted to keeping this fiction alive. They preach that the free market is the engine of prosperity, and the fuel of that engine is competition. And yet in practice, most of these same business people will do everything they can to stifle competition. In reality, they actually hate competition. They want to monopolize the competition. The Open Markets Institute, as the name suggests, is dedicated to opening up markets to more competition. According to their website, they are, quote, a team of journalists, researchers, lawyers, and advocates working together to expose and reverse the stranglehold that corporate monopolies have in our country. Matt Stoller is a fellow at the Open Markets Institute and an expert in monopoly power. He has most recently written about one of our favorite targets, Facebook. He thinks that the Federal Trade Commission should not just fine Facebook for their shady use of our data, but that the company should be completely restructured. This is important because Facebook has become the most popular way we Americans get our news, believe it or not. So we're looking forward to diving deeply into that with him in the first half of the show. Then after checking in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber, we will devote the second half of the show entirely to working our way through your listener questions. Our inbox has gotten quite full recently, so we're going to try our best to empty it. But first, David is going to introduce us to our guest, who will tell us how he proposes to break up Facebook.
Matt Stoller is a fellow at the Open Markets Institute. He is currently writing a book on monopoly power in the 20th century. Previously, he was a senior policy advisor and budget analyst to the Senate Budget Committee, and he is the co-author of the recent article published in The Guardian entitled, Facebook Must Be Restructured. The FTC should take these 9 steps now. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Matt Stoller.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, welcome, Matt. You're emerging as a major corporate critic. You actually quoted in the New York Times editorial recently, which is quite applauded for that newspaper. And I first met you when you were working in Congressman Grayson's office. And I noticed that you had some sharp observations about corporate power. So let me challenge you. You're writing a book on corporate power and monopoly in the 20th century. Good luck. You got a contract with Simon & Schuster. That's a breakthrough right there. But here's how I want to challenge you. Corporations have met every challenge that spells democracy in this country. They have either co-opted it, destroyed it, weakened it, or turned it to their own advantage. When the franchise came and people could vote, money corrupted politics. When people had freedom of contract and they could negotiate, in came the corporate lawyers with the one-sided standard contract to strip people of their negotiating rights and even the right to go to court when they're wrongfully injured. That's the compulsory arbitration. When the regulations started in the early 20th century, mostly, they knew how to develop what scholars have called regulatory capture. They either put their people in these regulatory commissions like the Securities Exchange Commission, high places, and or they just smothered them with lobbyists and political pressure. When Congress started hearings, they managed to blunt them, delay them, so there never was any legislation. When prosecutors try to prosecute them, number one, the prosecutorial budgets are disgracefully low for the corporate crime wave that's sweeping through our country, and that's a function of lobbying Congress to keep the corporate crime enforcement part of our federal government at a very, very starvation level. You know, I could go on, Matt, but every single move that the people took to restore our democracy, strengthen our democracy, has been blunted with the brilliant aid of these corporate law firms. And listeners, you want to know how much damage these big corporate law firms in New York, Los Angeles, Washington have done to you? Go to hlrecord.org. That's Harvard Law Record, hlrecord.org, and you'll see my description of the damage they've done, whether it's tobacco industry, the drug industry. Their main function is corporate immunity and corporate impunity. So you come along now, a fresh voice, you've done a lot of work. How are you going to deal with corporate power?
Okay, so I'm going to start with a quote that I think you'll enjoy. So this is an anonymous quote from the 1980s. For $500,000, you could buy any legal opinion you wanted from any law firm in New York. That was an anonymous lawyer turned banker. Probably a guy who worked for Michael Milken. So I think that what you've seen is, let me contrast that. I'll contrast that with a quote from Alexis de Tocqueville, who in 1835, the opening line of Democracy in America was, "Nothing struck me more forcibly than the general equality of conditions." And then if you bring it forward to 1954, Carl Kazin, Harvard antitrust economist, wrote, "The money trust has disappeared and Wall Street is a symbol only to students and those with long memories." Emanuel Zeller, a great congressman, chaired a special subcommittee on monopoly. I read his autobiography recently, and he wrote in 1953 that he was just always struck by how equal things were in the U.S. versus the inequality and cartels and monopolies of Europe. And that's what American capitalism meant to him. This is David Lilienthal in 1952. He wrote a book called Big Business, A New Era. The all-powerful tyrannic employer is all but gone. Gone too, except for historians, is the picture of workers who must endure long hours of labor with no vacations, no decent opportunity to have their grievances heard. And he was a Brandeis disciple and a New Dealer. I have a quote from John Kenneth Galbraith in 1958 in the Affluent Society talking about how outrageous it would be for business leaders to ask for high salaries, right? Because they would just be tacky. He was like, no one ever does that kind of thing. And then I'll read something from Walter Lippmann in 1937 talking about John D. Rockefeller. Before he started his enterprises, it was not possible to make so much money. Before he died, it had become the settled policy of this country that no man would be permitted to make so much money. He lived long enough to see the methods by which such a fortune can be accumulated, outlawed by public opinion, forbidden by statute, and prevented by the tax laws. And then I'll just finish with this one, which is a Chicago banker in 1950 who wrote, "Banks offer an opportunity to an educated, personable, and uncourageous young man for a pleasant, interesting, dignified life." All right. So the point of reading all of these quotes, aside from the fact that I enjoy them, is that, things weren't always this bad, right? I mean, we are living in a weird moment. And I started with that quote from 1980s where someone was just like, you can buy whatever you want from any law firm in New York, which is still true today. Things, they were never perfect. But the conventional wisdom that our government should work to generally battle against plutocratic forces, that's a part of our political tradition. And the loss of that tradition really starting in the late 70s, which of course you saw up close and you were an important part of, a lot of the things that you saw it. You were the main object of the Powell memo. We're in a new moment. And by new, I mean, the last 40 years, which I really think is an anomaly in American history. So, that's kind of where I start. And I got this from doing a bunch of research about how we've wrestled with corporate monopolies over the course of the 20th century and a little bit before that. But the reason I'm optimistic and I think that we can do something about the problems we're confronting is because corporate America is not one thing. And the corporation is just an apolitical legal institution or set of institutions. And what we're seeing now is a concentration of power that is so extreme that it is causing massive fissures in corporate America, the business world, and also the national security world, which is something that we haven't seen for quite a long time. So you're seeing like Oracle Corporation and Walmart, who are not progressive, hippy-dippy groups. They're trying to fight against Google and Amazon. I mean, you're seeing the New York Stock Exchange and Goldman Sachs at odds with each other about the amount of money that banks are going to have to pay for data feeds. And Goldman Sachs, in this case, is the anti-monopolist. You're seeing skepticism and suspicion on both sides of the aisle towards Facebook for a whole lot of reasons. And then you're seeing the hangover from the financial crisis in which everybody understands that too big to fail banks crash the economy, then that was increasingly understood as a political crisis. And what that does is it doesn't necessarily mean that we are going to be able to triumph over what I think are clearly autocratic forces. But it does mean that the people themselves are waking up to the fact that our corporate structures and our market structures and our financial structures are political, right? Markets are political. They're designed by rules that are put forward by public policy. And we were just persuaded in the 1970s that they weren't political, that they were just natural, and that we needed these economists, these scientists to sort of rule over us and tell us how to organize our political economy. And now what's happening is there's increasingly broad recognition that that's not true, that these are rules that we as a people decide ourselves. And I think there's still a lack of confidence that we can actually do this as a people, that we can operate through our democratic structures. But people are much more confident than they used to be. And I think the trend is actually heading, I don't want to say in the right direction, but it's certainly heading away from the status quo of kind of this dominant neoliberalism. Now, there are some very scary trends as well as some, I think, very hopeful trends. But there's a crisis of legitimacy in the system. And that's what we're going to do.
Let me challenge you here, Matt. We're talking with Matt
I don't like challenges.
Let me challenge you. If what you're saying is that starting with Reagan, especially in 1981, corporations have achieved far more power over our lives, you're right. In fact, I think you're understating it, as I'll point out in a moment. But you shouldn't try to look at the pre-1970 period as sort of fairly respectable capitalism. The exploitation of workers was horrible, as you know. The discrimination, bigotry against blacks, black farmers, black workers is horrible. Discrimination by corporations against women was historical. They bled people in every conceivable way, occupational disease, the coal mines, etc. However, they have gotten so much power now that they're strategically planning almost every aspect of the lives of the American people. They're strategically planning getting away with the healthcare system, which is corporatized, and drug prices, et cetera. They're strategically planning our military budget, strategically planning the commercialization of childhood, circumventing parental authority and selling them terrible things for their bodies and their minds, junk food, junk drink, violence, strategically planning what gets into the air and the water, and they're getting a lot of leeway with that under Trump. They're strategically planning our retirement, getting rid of defined benefit plans and putting in, if people are lucky, risky 401 plans. They're strategically developing the worst labor laws in the Western world against unionism. They certainly have strategically planned the use of our public lands, the use of our public airways, the so-called commons, on and on. And for people who want more specific numbers, about 1978, the CEOs of the top 300 Fortune corporations were paid themselves with their rubber stamp board of directors about 30 times the entry level or average level wage. It's now 300 times, and doesn't seem to be anything to stop them. The head of Boeing, whose practices in a company killed 346 people from Indonesia to Ethiopia, is now paying himself $12,000 an hour. That's what it breaks down to, $23.5 million plus all the benefits. So they have turned our country into a corporate state. And I think you probably dug up Franklin Delano Roosevelt's comment to the Congress in 1938 when he sent a proposal to set up an investigation commission called the TNEC to investigate corporate concentration of power. He said, whenever private power takes over government power, that's fascism. That's what he called it, 1938. So that's what we really have. We have American-style fascism. And they have co-opted almost every counter-challenge. Now, I, like you, are hopeful, and I like to be optimistic. And I see, there's some demonstrations here and there, the fight for $15 an hour. And I see a little bit of burp here and there at shareholder meetings by some of the religious groups on militarism. And I see some people elected to Congress, they're probably 2 to 3% of them now, who get it and are trying to challenge corporate power. But I also see Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, Wall Street, corporations. They talk a good game once in a while, but they don't do anything. And here's the rub. If someone told you 30 years ago that there are drug prices that have increased for necessary drugs, 500%, 1,000%. Yesterday, a drug was portrayed on television. The company increased it 97,000%. Insulin is going up. Other drugs are going up. And there wouldn't be a revolt in this country? I don't think you would say, are you kidding? They'd be marching in the streets. They're getting ripped off every way. You know, the mortgages and the collapse in Wall Street, and we hardly have any demonstrations, and less taxation than ever for global corporations. I mean, Amazon just made billions of dollars, didn't pay a cent in taxes, and got a rebate, for heaven's sake. 65 major corporations didn't pay any federal income tax last year, and they were all very profitable. So I'm going to push you. Let's say you're the czar, and someone says, Matt, you got all the authority under our Constitution to put these corporations under the rule of law and hold them accountable. What would you do?
Well, I'd pass the Industrial Deorganization Act of 1973 of Phil Hart, right? This is a no-fault deconcentration commission that would just go through, and any company that had of a certain size threshold that had a certain share of the market would just automatically be broken up. If you want one thing, there are plenty of things that we can do.
Why do you think breaking them up makes any difference? I mean, they broke up Standard Oil in the early 20th century. So we got Standard Oil of Ohio, Standard Oil of Indiana, Standard Oil of New Jersey. And what difference did it really make?
It made a big difference. I mean, first of all, the oil industry became more efficient because there were certain techniques that were held by some of the divisions of Standard Oil, and they weren't allowed to use them because of New York told them not to. Like Indiana had some technique, I think, for cracking oil. And then when the breakup happened, the Indiana Standard Oil actually implemented this technique, and it changed the oil industry. But then you also saw more regional equity, because instead of having one company headquarters in New York, where all the money would roll into, you had, I think it was 35 companies all over the country, headquartered in lots of places in the country. And that, while you had, the local elites in Indiana were pretty powerful relative to the rest of Indiana, at least they lived there. And that's a big deal, right? To have the local elites living.
Let's grant you that. Let's grant you that. We now have about 1,200 health insurance companies in the country. So it's not, we have 4 giant ones. But before they became giant, you had a lot of different companies. They were ripping people off the same way. Insurance companies rip people off the same way, whether they're concentrated or deconcentrated.
No, I don't agree. I don't necessarily agree. I mean, every market is different, but generally speaking, most states have, one or two companies that have, or a lot of states have 1 or 2 companies that have 80, 90% of the market, which is kind of funny because we already have single payer. It's just private single payer in a lot of places. But, the more power that you have, it's not that business people who run smaller companies are sort of more virtuous or less virtuous. And it's not that people that run bigger companies are like evil. It's just that if you have more power, the risk is that you'll be more abusive and that you'll engage in practices that are less attentive to people that are subjected to your power. So the idea with creating competitive markets and regulated competition, not competition just, throw them in there and just have them like Battle Dome, but actually regulating them so that they're competing over useful social ends. That actually is a check on power. And it is not a check on power that comes from government. It is a check on power that comes from fellow competitors.
There are a lot of companies engaged in payday loan rackets. How do you explain that? They're all ripping poor people off.
Payday lending shouldn't exist, right? That's an industry where, we've essentially legalized loan sharking. There's a whole bunch of industries, like you can have competition in, say, private prisons, but that industry shouldn't exist. As I say, it's market by market. But generally speaking, if you have like one search engine or you have one phone maker, 2 phone makers, you're not going to have, like, the iPhone basically hasn't gotten better for 5 or 10 years because there's really no competition spurring them to improve. And that's very different than, say, the personal computer industry, even though both the personal computer industry and the mobile phone industry saw the emergence of billionaires. In the personal computer industry, because of at least initially the open architecture, you saw really rapid technological advances and a lot of different businesses, a lot of different creativity And this is actually true. You go back to the electronics industry in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s when it was even more open. You can make a difference, and there is a reason that we still have some nice stuff in this society. We built that nice stuff at a certain point, and now we can't, Boeing 737 MAX is a disaster, but, we have these incredible technologies that we did build. Like, it did work at one point.
With very heavy government subsidies, free research and development, developed aerospace, biotech, nanotech, Silicon Valley, internet. We always have to pay tribute to the taxpayer who helped fund all this R&D and built these companies and didn't get anything in return. It was just given away. The R&D was given away the way they give the R&D to the drug companies.
I mean, we got flight, we got the internet, we got got things out of it. It's not that taxpayers didn't get anything. We got tremendous amounts out of it. I mean, we beat the Nazis. That's something, right? I'm an optimist because I see an ideological collapse of the framework that we built in the 1970s. It doesn't work anymore, and it's in the internal tensions. They're too extreme. So we're going to move to a different system. The question is, what is that different system that we're going to move to?
Okay, let me detect a remedy in your last recent remarks. You're talking about breaking up these companies and making them more competitive, but you're also talking about abolition. You're saying that if you bring back the usury laws that were repealed in the 70s by industrial lobbying, state after state, that the payday rackets, the rent-to-own rackets couldn't exist. You're talking about abolition. What other industries would you abolish, or parts of industries would you abolish?
Well, you want to wave a magic wand. I think we should nationalize the credit card companies because I think the payment system should be, that's effectively a 3 to 5% private sales tax. So I would just get rid of that. I would just nationalize that, have the Fed take it over. I had this conversation with an Atlantic Fed president one time, and I was a staffer, and I was like, why is it easier to pay for stuff on your phone in Kenya than here? And he was like, well, we don't have authority over the payment system. We consider ourselves more of a thought leader. And I was like, you're the Federal Reserve. Like, this is ridiculous. There's a bunch of babies who don't want to do their job. Sure. So, I would do that. And there's a lot of retailers, actually, who would support that because retailers are tired of getting ripped off by credit card companies. And then you have the cybersecurity problem, which is basically just identity theft is just counterfeiting. So
that's very interesting. I have not heard that before. Let's move to your favorite subject now, Facebook. It's been said Mr. Zuckerberg apologizes every day before breakfast and then keeps going to do what he wants to do anyway. So describe the problem of Facebook to our listeners and what you would do about it.
Sure. So the problem with Facebook is that we've centralized this important form of communications, social networking, for basically the entire world in the hands of one company and one small group of people. And that's catastrophic. And then beyond that, we have allowed that company to fund itself through advertising, which in the case of a communications network, it just means the distortion of the flow of information. Advertising, I think, is problematic in many different contexts, but it's manageable when you're talking about you have a lot of different channels to access information. But when there's an essential communications facility, we have traditionally not allowed advertising to distort the flow of information. So as an example, the problem, it would be as if with Facebook, it's as if they're a phone network. If I wanted to call a restaurant, I would dial that restaurant's phone number, but then I don't have to pay for that directly, that communication service. But then the way that communication network pays for themselves is they won't connect me to that restaurant. They'll put out to bid, hey, any restaurants in the area who wants to get Matt Stoller's call. And then any random restaurant that pays enough will get that call. And that's just a distortion of the flow of communication. So really the problem with Facebook, there are a lot of different problems. It's too big. It's got a number of different communication networks, and they're not enough executive focus on making sure that they work. But fundamentally, there's a conflict of interest baked in having a communication network that's financed through advertising.
What do you think should be done about it? And by the way, Facebook, and mention its tentacles, WhatsApp and so forth. It's not just Facebook.
It's a holding company, and in the holding company is Facebook, WhatsApp, Instagram. Sometimes you could think about Messenger. The other part of it is that Facebook, the way to think about it, and this is also true with Google and in some ways Amazon, it's like a railroad. And so if you think about it as a user, that's one context. But if you think about it like a publisher, like a newspaper or a content producer, you have to, at this point, to get your content to market, you really have to ride the rails of Facebook or Google. And so those are essential communication facilities. and they can shut you off whenever they want. And they have enormous power. And that's incredibly dangerous. We've never seen the centralization of information as extreme as we have it today.
Well, let me ask you some rapid fire questions. One, do you think that consumers should be able to charge Facebook for the personal information they give Facebook, which then sells it to advertisers and makes tons of money?
No.
Why?
Because your data is not property. Just like I don't think you should be able to, sell your own organs or various other things. There's a whole bunch of people who are using these communication networks. And if you have social scientists or you have government planners, let's say they want access to Uber data so that they can make better transportation infrastructure choices. Uber rides are not like property that those transportation planners should have to buy to access. Like it's communal. Like when the public creates data, some data is public data. I don't mean that it should be exposed publicly, but I mean that like it's a public commons. So another example would be farmers. There's a whole lot of data on how they grow crops, and the Department of Agriculture used to collect that information and then would, this is the kind of crop that grows well with this kind of soil, with this kind of rainfall, with this kind of seed. And then they would give that information out to farmers. They would collect it and then they would give it out, and they would help the market, oxygenate the market and improve the productivity of crops, frankly, all over the world. But the data that the farmers had about how the crops were growing, it's not really their property. It's kind of communal property. So I think data is not just one thing. It's many things. There's all sorts of administratability problems there, but fundamentally data isn't just property. It's many things.
So someone can accuse you of saying that Facebook has a right to get our personal information and sell it for billions of dollars to advertisers? What's the break on that?
I mean, my view is that Facebook shouldn't be able to advertise or run an advertising business. The problem isn't that Facebook collects the data. It's how they use the data for targeted advertising. And
okay, fair enough.
Also, yeah.
There have been studies showing that the advertising doesn't work very well, that mostly people are going to buy the product anyway. You think companies are wasting a lot of money advertising on Google and Facebook? And as you know, about 85% of all their revenue comes from advertising. You want to bring these two giants to heel. You get people in the business world saying it's not worth advertising on these companies.
Well, it's always tricky with advertising because, they've sold the story, right, that that advertising works. And the old joke with advertising is, well, I know half the budget, I know half the advertising works, I just don't know which half. And I think in a lot of ways what you find with Google and Facebook is it's kind of the same thing. So you put up a bunch of money to advertise your products, a bunch of people buy it, and you have no idea. And Facebook and Google can tell you the story about how the advertising on Facebook and Google was super effective, but you don't know if that's actually true. It's just maybe the most compelling story. And we also don't know if it's untrue. So certainly I can imagine that Facebook advertising certainly works in some contexts and doesn't work in other contexts. But of course it's, which half, right?
You know what, Matt? I've asked a lot of people, did you ever buy anything off of a Facebook ad? And I'm telling you, 95% of people say no. Maybe I'm asking the wrong people. Steve and David, have you ever bought anything off a Facebook ad?
No.
Never. Oh, yes, I have. Yes, I did.
Once?
Yeah.
In terms of what you're trying to do with Facebook, and we'll get what your more granular view is in a minute, I don't think enough attention is focusing on the advertising revenue. There have been some studies. There have been some studies, and they've been critical that the advertising really doesn't work as well as it's boasted. It doesn't even come close in some of these. But there needs to be more studies, because if you want to get Google and Facebook's attention, that's where you get their attention. They know how to game this thing with all kinds of esoteric phrases. They lose people's attention. The people just turn off. So what would you do with Facebook? The Facebook fine that's coming is rumored from the FTC, Federal Trade Commission, to be $5 billion. When that rumor floated on Wall Street, an hour after the stock exchange closed, Facebook stock shot up $40 billion more in value. $40 billion more in value, which led some newspapers to say, forget about the $5 billion fine. That's more than hardly a slap on the wrist. So what would you do? Do you need new legislative authority from Congress? And what would you do with Facebook and,
first of all,
Google?
Let's just be clear about something. It wasn't really a rumor. It was Facebook explicitly saying on its earnings report, we're going to pay between $3 to $5 billion, which is literally just public negotiations between the FTC and Facebook. Like Facebook's just saying this is what the fine's going to be. And Facebook's trade associations are actually lobbying for this fine. And they're saying this rumored fine number shows the FTC is a tough enforcer. So there's a big lobbying campaign for that $5 billion fine. But I'll just tell you, I don't know, maybe a year or two ago, not even 2 years, but a year ago or so, I was talking to a bunch of FTC people, and I was like, why don't you fine them $1 trillion so that you can restructure the company, because you have the authority to do that. And they were just like, oh my gosh, that's the most horrible thing in the world. Like, the most we could ever ask for is $100 million. And now Facebook is lobbying for $5 billion. So that's how much we've moved the argument. Although it was kind of funny when they were like, to bring that kind of fine, we'd have to go to court. And I remember thinking, I was like, do you not know where the court is? Like, did you not renew your bar license? Like, what's the deal? The basic idea here is that, the FTC has enough authority, right? We're not talking about them needing to bring an antitrust case or a consumer protection case. Facebook already has a consent decree with the FTC. So they've already said, here's a bunch of practices that we will not do. And every violation of the consent decree has a $40,000 up to $40,000 fine, which means if you just look at Cambridge Analytica, and that's not the only case here, that's 87 million violations at $40,000. So that's a lot of money, right? And so they could just bring a fine, and they can just say, look, we're going to bring $1 trillion fine against you on the consent decree unless you do X, Y, Z, D. And so they have the leverage, they have the authority. They just don't want to do anything because for ideological reasons.
What is XYZ?
So XYZ would be two basic things, principles. First is Facebook would have to admit wrongdoing. So that's a big deal, right? And all of the consent decrees and all during the financial crisis and all these different things, like all of these companies would pay a fine. Sometimes the fine would even be tax deductible, but they would never admit wrongdoing. And that is problematic for a lot of reasons. Morally, it's just wrong, but also it allows them to avoid private follow-on litigation. So first of all, Zuckerberg would have to just say, yeah, we violated the consent decree. And Facebook is going to fight that viciously. But we need, as a moral statement, we need the FTC to bring a case and say, you guys violated the decree, right? So that's number one, admit wrongdoing. The second is kill the incentive to collect the data. That's the other thing. I mean, I have a lot of other things that we'd want to do, but basically what they did in Germany, or what the antitrust authority in Germany is trying to do, is saying we're going to make the case that Facebook is not allowed to collect third-party data and use it for targeted advertising purposes, nor are they allowed to combine data from their different services and use that for targeted advertising purposes. So that kills the incentive to collect data, right? Because what's the point of collecting the data if you can't use it? And so that will actually kill the business model incentive to collect data, which was the point of the consent decree in the first place. So that's what I would do is those two things in principle. There's a whole lot of other things that we need to do to address problems with Facebook. But
how about user power? The users tried to organize Facebook users groups, and Facebook threatened litigation saying they were violating trademark of Facebook by using the word Facebook, and they sort of drifted away and didn't do anything. What about user power besides just dropping out of Facebook, which several 100,000 people did, but that's a drop in the bucket after the Cambridge Analytica scandal.
I think that this is not a place where you can have a consumer-oriented approach. I think this is where we have to do politics. First of all, the consumers are not really the people being harmed here. The people being harmed are actually the publishers. So if Facebook isn't using your data to take your stuff or your property, they're taking your data so that they can redirect the flow of ad money that used to go to newspapers to themselves, right? The institutions being harmed are the ones who are actually losing ad money. Rupert Murdoch, he's not a fan. So let's just be clear about the problem. I would say that this is a role for politics where we collectively come together and make decisions about how we want to run our society. So we should have this debate in the political arena and through our legislative bodies worldwide.
Okay, so we're about out of time, Matt. How do people reach you? And tell the people a little bit about your group and what it's doing. Sure.
So my group is called the Open Markets Institute, and we are a think tank that is focused on the problem of monopoly in America and across the world. And we are largely journalists and some lawyers who are just trying to tell this story. And we've been doing it for, we were part of another think tank starting, in 2010, and we went independent in 2017. We focus a lot on big tech. And then you can reach me. I am on Twitter at Matthew Stoller. That's my Twitter handle. MATTHEWSTOLLER, and I tweet too much there. And then you can find more information about me at mattstoller.com. There's also contact information. And then I'm writing a book, which should be coming out in October, called Goliath, the 100-Year War Between Monopoly Power and Democracy.
Very good. Thank you very much, Matt. Keep up the good work. We've been talking with Matt Stoller, who's coming out with this book in October. And if anything else, it's a good history of the days when corporations had less power over us and when there was more activity in Congress and the executive branch and the judiciary. The whole ethos of corporate accountability from the early 20th century to the mid-20th century has been demolished, and we've got a big challenge, listeners.
Can I tell you one thing I found in my book that has to do with you, which I thought was fun? So everybody thought the term too big to fail was coined in the 1980s with Continental Illinois, but I found an instance of you saying it in the 1970s when you were testifying.
Yeah, well, if I was getting an award for coining phrases, I'd be busy getting awards. But we want to get something done. Corporate welfare is one of mine. The mainstream press is one of mine. Corporate crime wave is one of mine. You see how far it's gotten us.
Crime in the streets.
We need younger people like you. Bring them in. And one of these days, the American people will say, hey, look, this is supposed to be a republic, not the Republic of Wall Street. And they'll use the kind of materials that you all are putting out and have a new Congress. Starts with Congress, I think. That's the big branch of constitutional power, and it's the smallest branch, and we know their names. Thank you very much.
Hey, thanks a lot. It's an honor.
As Ralph said, we've been speaking with Matt Stoller of the Open Markets Institute. We will link to his work at ralphnaderradiohour.com. We're going to take a short 1-minute break, and when we come back, we're going to plow through some long-awaited listener questions. But before we do that, let's head over to the National Press Building and check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, May 3, 2019. I'm Russell Mokhiber. The Environmental Protection Agency said the active ingredient in Bayer Monsanto's carcinogenic weed killer Roundup is safe, ignoring a growing body of independent research showing a strong connection between glyphosate and cancer in humans. Today's decision by Administrator Wheeler, like virtually every one he and the Trump administration make, completely ignores science in favor of polluters like Bayer, said Environmental Working Group President Ken Cook. This move by the EPA should not come as a surprise. Under the control of Trump and Wheeler, the agency is virtually incapable of taking steps to protect people from dangerous chemicals like glyphosate. A report published in January in the Environmental Sciences Europe documented how the EPA ignored a large number of independent, peer-reviewed studies that link glyphosate to cancer in humans. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. This one comes from Holly Masklins, and I have to admit, Holly has written to us numerous times, and we're finally getting to it. So there's a little irritation and sarcasm in her note here, but I'm going to read it anyway.
I'm sorry, we're out of time, Steve.
Here we go. No, Holly, hang on. Here's what Holly says. She says, okay, I got it. Your show never responds to my request for a discussion on vaccine safety. I get it. The subject is taboo. It's okay to be skeptical of other pharmaceutical products, but not vaccines. Parents are idiots when it comes to their children's health. Maybe baby steps are what you need to cast doubt in the safety of vaccines. Mary Holland's new book will get you started. The HPV vaccine on trial, seeking justice for a generation betrayed. Happy reading. So, Holly, we're going to respond to your question. Ralph?
Well, actually, Holly, whenever the pharmaceutical companies and the FDA use the word vaccine, they automatically want us to believe it's safe. Well, obviously, it's like any other drugs. All kinds of drugs are called vaccines for all kinds of ailments. So some of them may not be safe. Probably a majority of them are probably safe, although we don't know how they work in combination at a very, very tender age for an infant. That's a question. But we also need to know where they're produced. If they're produced in China or India and they're not under adequate federal U.S. inspection, that raises a yellow flag. So there shouldn't be taboo. The problem is that the vaccine industrial complex thinks that any questioning of vaccines will scare parents and they won't vaccinate their children, and then you'll have a problem in the schools. So that's their conundrum, other than the profiteering that's going on. Vaccines used to be very cheap, and now they're increasing the prices. So I always believe that we should follow the evidence, because otherwise, as you know, if there's no vigilance, you're going to get more and more vaccines for less and less serious ailments. You're going to get an overload. You're going to get kinds of immunity, side effects. So we have to put it all out on the open. But it doesn't help the cause, Holly, for people to come on and say all vaccines are a product of a conspiracy. That's what the vaccine people who are well-intentioned, some in the National Institutes of Health, are very concerned about.
Well, I hope that satisfies you, Holly. I'm sure I'll hear from you again. And please don't hesitate to respond to our response. Okay, we've got a couple of questions here about the Boeing MAX 8. David, why don't you take the first one from Dale West?
Ralph, are the flight attendants and pilot unions going to refuse to staff the 737 MAX aircraft? Their unions should have been the first to react after the first crash in Indonesia.
No, they're afraid of their jobs, and they can't pick and choose what airplane they're going to fly on any given day. They have been a little critical, some of them, but the union chiefs are under tremendous pressure by their airlines, United, Southwest, Delta, American, and they're not speaking up the way I would like them to. If you're an airline employee or a whistleblower, please call the anonymous tip line. Your anonymity will be protected. We have been assured. Call the anonymous tip line, 1-800-662-1859, 1-800-662-1859. I've never seen a time when more federal agencies are openly calling for whistleblowers. Congressional committees, even the FAA is called for whistleblowers. So this is whistleblower golden age. Go for it.
Very good. Thank you for that question, Dale. And this next question about the MAX 8 comes from William J. McIntosh, and he says, I am a former RCAF flight instructor. They are now doing more tests, so they should be asked in court, quote, were these tests to evaluate stall recovery? He says he bets they were. And he says also ask, why were these additional tests not done before certification? Also ask, how much did the nose wheel repositioning move the weight and balance tolerance point? And he says, good luck with your case. He thinks it's a piece of cake.
This is a good point. You ought to pass it on to flyersrights.org. That's a consumer group. Flyersrights.org, run by Paul Hudson, so they can raise this issue with the FAA. Unfortunately, the FAA is rushing to clear the 737 MAX to fly before an adequate review of the many problems with the plane can be conducted. We're trying to slow it down. Other groups are trying to slow it down. Maybe Congress will slow it down and say wait until the hearings are completed. But it's always a good idea for the FAA to hear from people like you.
This next question comes from Naguer Denora, who lives in Canada, and he or she, I'm not quite sure, says, my son passed away at age 24 years old from 2 traumatic brain injuries he sustained in an ATV accident. And he goes on to explain that he was not drinking, not speeding. He had his helmet on, doing all of that. And the question is, the ATV industry needs to be exposed. These machines have been maiming and killing people since the first three-wheeler was introduced on the North American continent by Honda. The three-wheelers ended up being banned in the 1980s, but were replaced by four-wheelers, which are just a three-wheeler with a fourth wheel. I was wondering if this was of any interest to you, you could point me to someone who would be interested in doing some sort of expose in this industry.
Well, it's been exposed, and it still is responsible by the design of its vehicle for about 600 deaths a year and 100,000 injuries, according to the Consumer Product Safety Commission's annual report. You know, that's quite a hideous record where safer designs or warnings to young riders might have diminished that fatality toll. So if you want to connect on this, and you certainly have a serious experience with losing your son, and you're probably driven to try to do something on that, contact the Consumer Federation of America, which is 202-387-6121. Tell them I suggested you call, 202-387-6121. And they're in Washington, D.C. It's 1620 I Street Northwest. And their email is cfa@consumerfed.org, cfa@consumerfed.org. It's amazing how year after year, Steve and David, this goes on, and it goes on, and it goes on. And off-road vehicles are designed to be driven only on off-road terrain, not paved surfaces. But off-road vehicles are difficult to control on paved surfaces and are at risk of overturning. And on paved roads, off-road vehicles are at a higher risk of colliding with cars, trucks, and other vehicles. There are different state laws. I'm sure there are different provincial laws in Canada, but those are the contexts. I hope you get a good response.
This one comes from Paul Levy. He says, Ralph, I won't be starting a watchdog group, but would like to join one in Illinois. I couldn't find it on the internet. How would I find one here in Illinois? I'm enjoying Mr. Nader's new book and love your program. Paul Levy.
Well, Paul, you're it, because there is no group in Illinois, so nominate yourself. Start it with a little letterhead with 5 or 6 friends. You'll have fun. You'll discover a new hobby. Gets to 10 friends, you start meeting in a living room. You go over my book called How the Rats Reformed the Congress, which is a way of getting people to laugh themselves seriously enough in order to organize such groups in various states to watchdog Congress. And you can go to ratsreformcongress.org, where you get a very serious tutorial on exactly, step-by-step, how to form a watchdog group in Illinois on the Congress. And you don't have to go all the way and absorb 20 hours a week. Just put your toe into the water a bit and see how interesting it is and what kind of reaction you'll get from your 2 senators and representatives.
All right. This next question comes from Dan Lett, who says, I listened to your interview with Walter Hang of Toxic Targeting and was really struck with the distinction both you and Walter drew between committed, effective activism and the less effective type that seems to dominate the large fundraising advocacy organizations. Says, I'm in Surrey, British Columbia, Canada, and I'm looking to devote some of my time and resources to groups who are effective at their job of advocating for environmental and social justice. Which groups in Canada are worth getting involved in? I'd very much appreciate any advice. Thank you for your important work.
Well, we contacted Toby Heaps, who is a publisher in Canada and public-spirited. He recommends Sierra Club in Canada, Greenpeace in Canada, and a group I helped encourage, Democracy Watch. That goes to democracywatch.ca. They are located in Ottawa. Those are 3 groups. And then if you're in British Columbia, look up Dr. Suzuki. He was a television star on environment for many years and one of the best-known names in Canada. He has a Suzuki Foundation, and he's very approachable, and he'll give you more granular information about British Columbia and what's going on.
This next question comes from Paul Koulas. You kind of touched on this a question ago, but I think it bears repeating. He says, Ralph, this week's Toxic Avenger podcast was super inspiring. I've heard you talk about how citizens have the power, but I felt helpless. I listened to your message, but then I'd say to myself, how am I going to take on Goliath? Now, after listening to Walter Hang, I'm convinced I can. Walter talked about how he just followed your plan, read your books. You kind of talked about how the rats reformed Congress, but he's asking, what books of yours should I read to learn how to do what Walter did?
Well, obviously, it's the book Breaking Through Power. It's easier than you think. And that's the way I approached it. I give a lot of examples on how a few people made great progress, the various techniques they have developed. And also, around page 140 or so in the book is a citizen summons, and you can fill in the blanks on your main issues of concern, where you summon the senators and representatives to your own town meetings. For that, you need about 500 clearly legible names with emails and addresses on a petition. We'll get a senator. 500 clearly written names, not scribbled on a petition by someone standing on a street corner, so they know that these are people who are now in touch with each other and they're serious. And it takes less than that to get a congressperson to come. Once you get them in a town meeting, there's no more flax. There's no more, being put on hold. There's no more greenwashing or whatever. You're facing them eyeball to eyeball, and they get a good experience, and you send them back with their instructions.
Very good. Ralph, before we go, I just wanted to talk to you about something you were quoted in the New York Times this week about Apple buying back $75 billion of its own stock. And you were quoted as saying that this was insane and that Apple could spend a small fraction of that $75 billion it plans to give investors by recycling the world's computer waste, cutting the prices of iPhones that have swelled past $1,000, increasing the pay of its contract workers in China, who make only $3.15 an hour. But this was the response from another economist who thought that was too simplistic. And I'll quote this from the New York Times, quote, "Firms should reinvest internally when it's their best use of capital, and they should pay it out to investors when it's not," said Lori Hodrick, a visiting finance professor at Stanford University who studies how corporations use their cash. What do you say to that rebuttal?
A lot of things. Number one, Tim Cook and a couple other men at the top decided that they're going to spend another $75 billion, which comes from consumers of iPhones and other Apple services, on stock buybacks after they just finished $100 billion of stock buybacks, which increases the metrics for the executive compensation package of Tim Cook and his top bosses in Apple. It doesn't create a single job. Number two, they never even asked their owners, the stockholders and the institutional individual stockholders, permission. They just did it on their own to show you again the massive dictatorial hierarchy of these giant corporations. They ignore their own owners, and they've rendered their owners powerless. And to finish it off, they control the Securities Exchange Commission and the Congress on this. Number three, they should do this for their shareholders. It doesn't do much for stock prices. It can bump it up a little bit for a few days, but there are too many other things, the Federal Reserve, what's happening with the China trade, a particular disaster, Samsung cutting into their sales. What they should do, if they just are interested in their shareholders, is give it out in dividends. It goes to pension funds, it goes to individual shareholders, it goes to mutual funds, it gets spent in the economy. Instead, they're burning it through stock buybacks. And there have been $7 trillion of stock buybacks in the last 10 years by major U.S. corporations who, having gotten a huge tax break to bringing their profits from abroad back to Washington, compliments of Trump and the Republicans, are now burning it instead of what they promised they would do, which was invest, quote, in productive facilities and jobs, end quote. Just another corporate betrayal of Congress, and what do they care? They get away with it. I don't think anybody 30, 40 years ago ever dreamt that corporations would be so drowning in capital, which is another way of saying excess profits that are under tax, that they can just burn it that way, especially when the stock is near its high. It's one thing if Apple stock collapsed from, say, $210 to $50. They say, hey, this is a good buy, because the stock's going to bounce back and we'll make a profit. But the worst time to do a stock buyback is at its peak. And a lot of these companies are going into debt to raise money in a low-interest era in order to do stock buybacks. So if Steve Silberstein, the corporate commentator from San Francisco, told me the other day, what if there's a downturn in the economy? You have all these highly indebted corporations. Corporate debt is at a screaming high at the same time as they're drowning in capital. So they're destabilizing the economy for the next decades. So I think Stanford ought to have higher standards for their professors.
Okay. There you go, Lori Hodrick. You've heard from the man.
They weren't always allowed to buy back their own stock, right? Isn't this
that's a good point, David. Until 1982, the Securities Exchange Commission considered stock buybacks manipulation of stock by insiders. And then Reagan appointed a nice SEC chairman for Wall Street, coming from Wall Street, and he allowed it. And it's off to the races. It's the biggest misuse of capital in American corporate history. And Bill Lasonik, Lasonick, a professor at University of Massachusetts Lowell, is a national expert on this. Look him up and read his writings. I've just scratched the surface of how stock buybacks distort the investment priorities of American companies, and even worse than just distorting is that they are underinvesting now compared to Japanese, Chinese, and European corporations who don't quite engage in such massive stock buybacks. They find other more productive uses, like shoring up the pension funds, let's say, like opening new plants and facilities, like spending money on environmental pollution controls, like increasing the salary for their workers. Just for a fraction of that $75 billion, David, they could double the pay of 900,000 serf laborers in China who construct their iPhones. Double the pay for probably less than $5 billion.
Wow. All right. Thank you for your questions. Keep them coming on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour website. I want to thank our guest again today, Matt Stoller from the Open Markets Institute. For those of you listening on the radio, that's our show. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call the Wrap-Up. A transcript of this show will appear on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour website soon after the episode is posted.
For Ralph's weekly column, it's free. Go to nader.org. For more from Russell Mokhiber, go to corporatecrimereporter.com.
And Ralph has got 2 new books out, The Fable, How the Rats Reformed the Congress. To acquire a copy of that, go to ratsreformcongress.org. And To the Ramparts, How Bush and Obama Paved the Way for the Trump Presidency and Why It Isn't Too Late to Reverse Course. We will link to that also.
The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt and Matthew Marin. Our executive producer is Alan Minsky.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Camp Harris. Our proofreader is Elizabeth Solomon.
Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour when we welcome back Congressman Jamie Raskin. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, everybody. And we're getting orders 5 at a time for this rat book on how rats reformed Congress. So if you want to see why people are ordering 5 at a time, maybe living room discussions, go to ratsreformcongress.org and see for yourself.
Hello, this is Jimmy Lee Wirt, producer of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Welcome to the wrap-up. First, Ralph talks a little bit more with Matt Stoller about the financial sector.
Where would you stand on the rating agencies that, get money to give companies issuing bonds and stocks, et cetera, high ratings, like Standard & Poor? Would you have the SEC do that?
I haven't really thought through how I'd address capital markets. My general sense is that I think that's something that New Dealers got a little wrong. Like, I don't think we should have capital markets in one place. I think we need a lot of local capital markets because fundamentally you can't replace local bonds of trust with structured credit rating. Like, it doesn't matter. I mean, yeah, they're obviously super corrupt, like Moody's, and they're all owned by, or like Warren Buffett owns one of them, which is kind of funny. Ultimately, like, what you want is you want people that are lending money to really be doing due diligence when they're lending that money. And the same thing with stocks. I kind of feel like the way that this is just super radical stuff that I don't actually think a lot about financial services because I think a lot about big tech, but basically people should be able to put their savings into their local community as opposed to what they do now where they put it into BlackRock or they put it into a mutual fund or whatever. And then it goes to a whole bunch of intermediaries who then, maybe even if you got rid of the corruption within the intermediaries, it's still absentee ownership, as Brandeis would put it. I think we should be able to put our money to work in our own communities.
One way to do that is called displacement. So there's a state bank in North Dakota. It's 100 years old. It's working. It's clean. It didn't collapse during the Wall Street collapse. It provides farmer loans, student loans, small business loans, and it's owned by the state of North Dakota. Now, as you know, there's a growing movement for public banking in California, New Jersey, elsewhere. Do you favor that? And if you do, you want to explain it and how it saves taxpayers money and how important it is?
Well, I'm really out of my wheelhouse here. I can talk about what I think we should do with banks, but I've been thinking about what we need to do with Facebook. But
we're going to get to that. We're going to get back to that.
I guess what my view on how do you make credit allocation more effective is you need a diversity of institutions to do that. And private lenders are bad at it for a variety of reasons. They're good at certain parts of it, but what you really need is you need a whole bunch of government institutions, public institutions, local institutions to actually be lending money and helping to start businesses. Because one of the things that we find, and there's a lot of ways to do that, but one thing that's, I think, fairly clear is that large companies have a borrowing premium over small companies because there's it's essentially a too big to fail premium, risk premium built into the lending structure. And so that's an unfair competitive advantage for large companies. And so one of the things that the New Dealers did in the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, and then eventually that turned into the SBA when the Republicans got their hands on it in the 50s, is they provided capital for small businesses directly. They created the small business lending market, which had been a kind of a predatory market before that. And actually the SBA still has the authority. They like to hide it, but they still have the authority to make direct loans to businesses. And I think they should just start doing that. But of course, doing work is hard. It's easier to not do anything. So they don't like to do that. And so I'd say that we need a lot more institutions that are dedicated to lending money to people. I like the idea of, this is actually something Thomas Paine put forward, which I think is a good idea. We should give everybody when they turn 18 or when they turn 21 some large slug of money, $10,000, whatever it is, so that they can use that to start a business if they want to. I think we just need a lot more work on getting capital to lots of people, particularly just, people from marginalized communities that don't have access to, the social networks where there's capital. We need to get them capital so that they can start businesses if they want to.
Do you believe in universal basic income?
No, I don't. I think that's conflicts with kind of my ideology. Like I think a job is just a problem that we give people money to solve. And if you think, and a lot of Silicon Valley oligarchs love UBI, and the reason they love it is because, and UBI is just, you just get money regardless. The reason they like it is because it's a way of redistributing income and resources without redistributing power. And fundamentally, what we need to do is redistribute power. And that means that people have to have their own ability to make money through their own productive efforts. And no one should be able to take that away from them. If you put a UBI in, right, if you allow the state to just fund people on something that they didn't earn or they didn't perceive that they earned, then what ends up happening is they're going to start putting in all sorts of political restrictions on there. First, it'll be, anybody who was in prison or anybody who was a child molester and anybody who is this or that or this other thing. Then it'll be anybody who goes on strike. And so what you're doing is you're actually creating this incredible political dependency. And I think that's very dangerous.
And now Ralph answers another listener question.
This one comes from Steve Harris. He says, Dear Ralph, a socialite in my community runs an NPO whose stated mission is, quote, to remove landmines and other war debris from the environment, to reclaim the land, replant the crops, and rebuild the agricultural industry to help heal families, communities, and nations. For this, U.S. aid provides the NPO with a grant of over $3.4 million a year. Out of that, this socialite and her husband pay themselves $365,000 in salary. There are also two other external advisors who are paid $255,000 and $100,000 a year, respectively. How is it possible that these people can line their pockets with money that is supposed to be intended for the dirt poor and war-stricken farmers of Afghanistan and the like? Is there any way to hold these people accountable?
Yes, because the Office of Inspector General hotline accepts tips, allegations, and disclosures from all sources about potential fraud, waste, and abuse. They've put out some really tough reports on huge waste of U.S. taxpayer money in Afghanistan, and they focus on mismanagement regarding programs and operations related to U.S. Agency for International Development. So here's what you can do. For email reporting, you can send your complaints to ig.hotline@usaid.gov. That's ig.hotline@usaid.gov. If you want to telephone your complaint, you can complain to 1-800-230-6539. 1-800-230-6539. If you want to do it with an online complaint form, you can see that they've received a lot of complaints about corruption and waste, U.S. taxpayers in Afghanistan. If you want to complete the online complaint form, you can go to 202-216-3801, 212-216-3801. And there's always the postal approach. You just write to the U.S. Agency for International Development, Officer of Inspector General, P.O. Box 657, Washington, D.C. 20044.
It says here they make $365,000 a year in salary. How many federal government employees make $365,000 a year?
Beside the president, you can count them on your fingers of your two hands.
And that's a wrap. Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour when we welcome back Maryland Congressman and constitutional scholar Jamie Raskin. Until next time.
Stand up, you've been sitting ready.